Welcome to Recross the Paths, compact cube conversations with designers and curators. If you get really excited about the numbers in this week's episode, be sure to check out a link to Daniel's cube in the show notes, which the overview is particularly good about going into greater detail on some of the things we talk about, and it includes a link to the algorithm itself if you're so inclined to explore that further. Also, I was assured that I could say either data or data, so forgive my flip-flopping through the episode. Hello, my name is Cade. Today I am joined by Daniel to talk about the data generated vintage cube. How are you, Daniel?
I'm well. Yourself, Kate?
I am doing just wonderfully, and I'm so excited to talk about something that is honestly a little outside of my comfort zone. This is a fascinating project, and I'm thrilled to dive into it.
Yeah, I'm excited to share.
So to get us started, would you give us an overview of the data generated vintage cube?
Yeah. So the data generated vintage cube is a cube that is created by an algorithm. That means that the card choices in the cube are not chosen by a human, not chosen by me, the curator, and that I think is pretty unique. And then further, it's a powered vintage cube, which is kind of harkens back to sort of the roots of cube. So when a lot of people think of cube, they think of the most powerful cards in Magic. That's what this cube is. And further, this cube is, because it's generated by an algorithm, it's generally pretty up to date with the most recent cards that are kind of at the highest power levels of a vintage cube environment.
And so most people, when they design cubes, don't start with the data. What led you to begin with a process like that?
So I'm a data scientist, machine learning engineer by trade, and so I spend a lot of my day trawling through data and looking for patterns and outliers in data. And so this kind of came naturally to me. And I think when I started designing or kind of getting into Cube in around 2017, my first sort of forays uh, were on Cube Tutor, and Cube Tutor had this really nice functionality where you could see the top and most played cards in a cube. And I believe that he also Ben Titmarsh, the person who um, designed Cube Tutor, had a representative like Popper Cube. It was like the sort of average of like what other cubes designers were doing in a certain format. And so my first cubes were kind of just looking at like what are like other people doing in a cube environment, and let me kind of replicate that because I find that interesting. Um, and then for further, also, it's like I've frequently been quite busy, and so haven't kept up on spoiler season, and so it's quite nice to have someone else do a lot of the work for me if I'm too busy to like follow up on spoilers. So that can be pretty handy.
So imagine it's like having a system that gives you a news ticker of what the most important updates are release to release.
Yeah, that's kind of like that was like the initial idea, and I think that's largely what we're seeing now too in output of the vintage cube as well, is that things come in that are new and powerful, and sometimes there are even old cards that can come into that environment that are old and powerful but have gotten better with the printing of different cards. So I think Flash is a good example where over the last year that card has been added. And then you see other things kind of depart the cube that have maybe been staples but are just no longer good enough, like things like Mold Drifter has departed the cube, I think, quite a while ago now. But the times have been are changing, I suppose.
RIP to Muldrifter.
Right.
When you're building a cube based on data, how do you determine what data to start with?
Yeah, that's great. And so, one of the things that I think is fantastic about Cube is it's, your own expression of creativity. And rightly so, I think it's awesome that so many Cube designers take pride in, the process of creating a cube, and that means like going out and finding those things that are highly synergistic and or fit a theme. And this is a very different cube construction process whereby I'm not for any cube that I'm creating, not picking the cards or the strategies and the synergies, and instead the things that you see in the cube are really at large are the aggregate decisions of a bunch of cube designers. And so, one of the levers that we have to, again, express creativity in this is then to determine like what data we get to sample. And so the process that I've created really allows you to submit a JSON, which is a chunk of structured text that has various like values in it that a application can read. And part of that is a list of cubes that you might want to sample. And that is, part of that creativity. Like, what are we going to sample to make a data generated vintage cube? But also, this process can be applied to any subset of cubes that you might be interested in. So if you are an old school player, you might be curious like what other old school, players are putting in their cubes. If you are a popper player, you might get a subset of popper cubes to sample to understand what are, cards and strategies that are commonly played. I use this all the time for discovery. And so I think, yeah, that's the first lever, is that data.
With so many options for what is classified as a vintage cube, how do you determine the best data for that, or what data you would want to keep out?
Yeah, because I have to throw out. There's like, I don't know how many thousands of cubes on CubeCobra, but you have to throw out like the majority of the data, because it's not like a lot of it's not good for that process. So in my case, we have access to the AWS bucket that contains all the CubeCobra data. For those not familiar, basically a place to store data on the cloud, and so we can pull down that data in bulk. Um, and then we can also submit like the cubes that we want to sample, so we can force that. But we can also filter through this AWS bucket, and we can say that, for example, we want the vintage cubes, in which case we'll pull back things that must have like the power 10. In this case, that's Time Walk, Ancestral, Black Lotus, Five Oxen, Soul Ring, and Mana Crypt. That's like criteria number one. Has to have those 10 cards. Um, because those really epitomize the sort of like they're like the highest like outlier in terms of like CubeCobra Elo score, which is something I use heavily. And so that's the first like thing. Second thing is that we're looking for cubes that are of an appropriate size, because cube designers have a wide range of cube sizes that they use. And so my case, I like 360 cubes, because this is for vintage cubes specifically, because I found that when you go up to like 540, there's a really big drop off in the power level of cards at 540, and so I wanted to just kind of keep it concentrated. And I like it too that my drafters get to get a good shot at getting one or more pieces of power.
Do you think that some of that data gets diluted at 540 also, that you start seeing a broader spectrum of inputs?
You do, like, there's more variability, and that's expected at 540. But also we have as I go into this further, there's a lot more cube data at 540 than there is at 360. Like, I'm kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but by the time we're done sampling cubes at the size 360, which works for me, we're left with about 100 to 110 data points. Whereas if I sample at 540, I usually have about 400 data points. And so we have actually stronger signals at 540. But there are some idiosyncrasies that like often come up with cubes at 360 that I think are interesting, which is it tends to be oddly that for some reason cube designers of 360 lists have a predilection for putting time vault in their cubes, and that does not occur as often in 540 lists. So the cube size is one thing that we do filter on. And then I think one of the other interesting things, again going back to the creativity aspect of it, was that Keldon Campbell, who's Oinkinator on Discord, and he's also part of the sort of my local play group here in Seattle. We were chatting once, and I can't remember how it came up. Basically, the idea that he had was that, like, well, people who care about their cubes should get like more of a sort of say in like how what goes into like a cube, which does make sense. And so I had already had a way to filter and pull back cubes that had N or more followers, which kind of filled that requirement, but also didn't really. It kind of left me with some like stale data. Where, a good example of this was is the if you go to CubeCobra, you'll find the SCGCon cube from like 2018, and it has like a lot of followers, like 120 or so, and so it's a fairly popular cube, but it hasn't been updated in like what 4 or 5 years because it was for a single tournament, and so including that in the data would have been bad. And so this idea from Keldon was to like basically throw that data out somehow. And so I started also finding ways to filter out based on when the last update a cube designer has made. And so I'm throwing out data that hasn't been updated in the last 365 days. So you have to also like update your cube in the last 365 days, as well as have, I believe it's one or more followers on CubeCobra to be sampled for the data generated vintage cube. So I think those are all the sort of the sampling constraints.
Well, I appreciate that that's set up so that there's no gamesmanship in it. Not that anybody's out to, to foul up the data for you, but there's no way to create this in a way that it's going to impact the results.
It's hard, yeah. The biggest way to game it would be to get a massive amount of followers and then update your cube every day. Although,
So you're saying the
yeah,
best way to do that would just to become an influencer in the Cuba community.
yeah, it's true. So, for example, like I sometimes will like maybe like sample like the LSV cube, or the Caleb Gannon Synergy cube, among others, and they don't have an outsized impact, but they do have a discernible impact because there's some other things that I'm doing to like weight the cubes themselves. A cube like the LSV cube, if I sampled it, would have more weight because you have more followers. And generally it's fairly up to date. But yeah, everyone still like gets a decent amount of weight in terms of like what their card decisions are that go into the sort of final output. Which kind of brings us, I guess, to the like kind of the next thing. If you're interested in talking about it, is like, okay, so once we've sampled all this data and that's one lever we can control, like, well, great, now what?
Absolutely.
How do we like choose the cards, or things like that?
Right. And I love the now what.
Right, yeah, because like after we do this, like I'll pull back a bunch of like cube lists from CubeCobra, like, okay, what could we do? And I think like the very, very earliest like versions, when it wasn't a data generated vintage cube yet, it was just like me like looking at data. Like I would just be counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like how many instances of like faithless looting do I have, and like the top end cards get to go in. But really, like that is good for getting a lot of the glue cards that are staples, have been around for a long time. It also kind of makes it so that if you just did the raw counts, a lot of like old cards that are just really no longer relevant are going to be kind of sticking around longer than they really should. And so I wanted, one of my goals also was to be up to date. And I want to make sure that like, you know, new cards from the most recent sets are going to be represented here. And so those aren't going to be the most played cards. So how can we, make sure those get in? And so this part gets a little complicated, but high level is basically there's an algorithm that weights each individual card that a cube designer has chosen to include in their list, and there are a lot of things that go into weighting a card. And so I'll kind of give a sort of a quick bullet point list, and we can kind of dive into any of these things that you are interested in talking about a little bit more.
Absolutely. Let's jump into it.
Yeah, so a card is weighted by several different things. Um, so it's right now I do half of a whole 50% of the card's weight is the CubeCobra Elo score. That's a huge one, and that's really important because the CubeCobra Elo score is really determined based on what people are picking in drafts on CubeCobra. So the card cannot have a high Elo if people are not picking it highly. And so, and I don't exactly know all the details of how the Elo score is calculated on CubeCobra. I think Gwen has walked me through it like once really quickly before. But I believe it has to do with pick rates. So if you pack one, pick one a card, its Elo score goes up. If you pack one, pick one a card against other cards that also have high Elo scores, then your Elo score is going to go up even more. Versus if you pack one, pick one a card that has you pick against basically cards with low elo, your elo score move less. So that's why you get like this crazy outlier elo for like a card like Black Lotus. It's got like I think it's like an elo of like 20,000 or something like that. It's because everyone's pack one pick winning a Black Lotus over basically almost anything. I think the only time you do that is pack three, and like there's something else that's like highly synergistic. So the Q code elo score, again, very important because it's a good measure of what people actually care about when they're drafting. So that's half the whole equation right there. The other half is the cube weight for that card. So every card will have a cube weight, and that is basically when we do the sampling process from that, when we get that data, we basically calculate a weight for each of those cubes. And the cube weight has its own sort of subcomponents to it. And so that would be things like that follower count. Is we have a way to calculate a weight for that follower count, its cube popularity. And we have also the cube update frequency. So like how often you're doing it with a maximum of a 1 week rolling window to actually discount people who are making like say 20 edits in a day, because that definitely happens a lot.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's fantastic. It's usually, I see that a lot, like when like people are like tinkering and making updates for like a new set, and they're not, it's not just one thing. They're just kind of pulling things in and out, and that's fantastic. But we can't like obviously give you 20 points or whatever it is for making 20 edits in a day. So basically it's like a rolling window of like, okay, you made like an edit in the last week, you get 1 point. You made 20 edits in the last week, you get 1 point. And so you can every week you could get like a maximum of like in number of points. And then cube recency, update recency as well. So if you update today, your cube's going to get a little bit of a higher weight than say if you update last week versus 9 months ago. And so all those things kind of play together to make sort of a single weight for the cubes, and that actually works. It works pretty well to sort of highlight those designers who care a lot about their cubes, who are staying current with the sort of changes in any environment. And it also interestingly allows for the inclusion of cards that are not played by the majority of cube designers, but are combined with the elo score, they allow things like, for example, just in the vintage cube, I'm going to pull it up here, but I've got a section on the sort of elo distribution, and in that you have like these outliers. Or sorry, below the outliers, you have things that have like really low play rates, but like high elo rates, and this kind of process allows things like, well, if you've played Vintage Cube, you know that these things should be here, but things like the Goblin Bombardiers, which is a relatively new card, but it's not actually played that yet in a lot of lists. Like people haven't updated all their lists yet, but this process allows those cards to kind of filter to the top, which I think is very fascinating. It's exactly what I personally want in keeping a cube up to date with a sort of quantitative process. And that list that we're looking at, it changes from like sort of update to update. What happens is like Cube All Stars will actually pass through that kind of list where like people are just kind of adding it to their list. I think once upon a time, it's like Atraxa and the One Ring went through that, like where like vintage cube designers had not sort of updated their lists yet, or like maybe things hadn't quite caught on yet. And so I kind of watched that sort of list for places where diamonds in the rough, so to speak, will sort of crop up.
So as you're assigning weight and value to these cards as they come through, are you expecting an even output in terms of maybe color or type or anything like that, or is that something that
Oh,
you manage?
that's a great question. That is a great question. Yeah, so I think one of the earliest approaches to this that I had just assigned like equal sort of quantities of cards to each color, and this is like probably the most common thing among like cubes designed out there anyways. Like people just kind of do for spreadsheet aesthetics, they keep even numbers, but I also weight the quantity of cards of each color. So when I sample all the cubes, I will count up like the number of, say, like white cards in a cube, and I'll assign like okay, how many, what's the percentage, and then I'll go through all the other cubes and do the same, what's the percentage, and then I'll like average them together, so I get the average quantity of like white, blue, what multicolored cards, whatever, and basically that will sum up to one at the end, and then you get sort of like that distribution of what the like quantity of each kind of category that cube designers are putting in their lists. And so that's why you'll see on my the data generated vintage cube that the spreadsheet aesthetics are certainly broken to basically have the sort of quantity of colors that the cube designers on aggregate are putting in their cubes.
So as you have all of this data together and as you're making decisions based on card weights, card values,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do when human intuition kind of comes into conflict with the information you're seeing? Like say you would see a pair of cards you would expect to see together, or you're like one piece that's out of place.
Yeah, that's another great question. So in this case, like the example that has come up a couple times is like the splinter twin combo. When usually it's in the cube, but there have been times when I've sampled it and we get things like Kiki Jiki and Splinter Twin are in the cube, but the blue combo half of, is like missing. So there's like no Pestermite or no Deceiver XR, which like you know, you can still have a value like Splinter Twin, I guess, on your Eternal Witness or something. It's not great, but I mean, well, it's fine, But I think a lot of people would expect to have that in the queue. And so, what do you do in that case, and why is that happening? First of all, and I think that's happening because, like in this case, we have a well-defined combo uh, where you need an engine piece, a critical piece. There's only like one or two copies of. In this case, like it's Kiki Jiki and Splinter Twin, but that combo can work with other pieces. In addition to the blue parts, you got like Restoration Angel and Zealous Conscripts, and so those parts are cards that are blue that are getting dropped off or actually being filtered out because there's more ways to combo than are just the blue cards, and so those things kind of get washed out in the data. And a similar thing happens with Time Vault, where there's a lot of ways to untap a Time Vault or to copy it, for example. But there's only one Time Vault. There's like that is a really unique effect,
Right.
and so all the lists that have that combo have to have Time Vault. They don't have to have Voltaic Key. They can do that with things like Sahili Sublime Artificer to like copy a Time Vault and it enters untapped, right? So because you have a lot of instances where you have like a Time Vault, but not as many, say, as like the Sahili, then you just kind of left with half a combo. So what do we do in these instances? Well, if you're truly data generated, you can keep it as it is. And like I have done that. Like, okay, well, it's a data generated cube. There's a Time Vault, but there's like nothing in there. So just for like having it up on CubeCobra, that's what I do. But like in practice and paper, something that I'll do is I have a function to blacklist cards. So you can provide a list of cards you don't want to put in the cube. So I can blacklist a Time Vault or a Splinter Twin if I really wanted to, and generate the cube without that half. And so that's what I've done. So, and by the way, that blacklist, you can do whatever you want with it. I had a buddy who loved to win with bribery. Like that was like the only way he could win. Like, so I was like, oh man, I'm just blacklisting this card. I mean, right now I don't run any blacklist at all generally because like it's for the community at large. Like here's a cube that is 100% data generated is really what everyone's doing. So like bribery's currently in I don't know for how much longer, but like it is currently in the cube. But like if there's things you don't like, you can always like blacklist it and like not play with those cards. Or if like you have half a combo, you can like blacklist it. But I do think that's like an artifact of that data generating process, which like could be improved, or two could just be an artifact too of also the data that you sample. And when I was looking at CubeCon 2024 lists, someone made a comment that like on at like the most frequent cards, like we had like things like the engine cards for the reanimate combo, like the best ones, like reanimate, animate, dead, were in there, but all the animation targets were like non-existent in this like sort of average CubeCon list, and I think the reason is actually the same. It's because like you have some everybody wants the like the engine card that's the best, but like you can have a lot of choices in terms of like the reanimation targets you choose. Like if you're in my case like a vintage power level cube, you're going to have like the modern like Gristle brand ones. But if you're an old border cube that has the design restriction that you have to play with an old border, or maybe it's like you're playing with cards up to Scourge, you can still have reanimate. You're going to have it because it's like an amazing card, but your reanimation targets are like, I don't know. I think I was thinking of like Nightmare, but there's probably other like reanimation targets for that era that I'm not aware of. But so when you like combine those data sets together and you sample, like those engine and glue cards are going to filter to the top, but the choice of like ways that you finish the game are kind of going to be washed out, in the data.
So Nightmare and Grizzleband pretty close to each other in power level, I suppose, right?
I suppose so. It depends. Yeah, right. I don't know. I'm actually really excited to play the Alpha Reimagined Cube. That one's not necessarily sort of border restricted or anything like that, but that definitely, yeah, I think that's going to be interesting because the power level of the ways to finish things in that cube is very very different. So yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to at CubeCon 2024.
So where do you find an outlet for creativity in your curation, or is that a target of this kind of project? Does that come from how you manipulate your parameters, or are there other ways that you inject yourself into the process?
Yeah, so I mean, my creativity in that process for me personally is probably quite different than your average cube curator, right? Who is on Scryfall with like the insane like regex filter, like searching for just the right cards.
People feeling
My
attacked right now.
no, I think it's awesome. But like, I think because Keldon again is part of my play group, and I know his process for like Bolt Cube, for example, has been like go search for some like really like esoteric things on Scryfall, right? Like has the Scryfall filter set up for the things that he wants, or if you're like really trying not to play certain things too. Like I know people have like their own sort of Scryfall filters set up, and I think that's fantastic way to find sort of the niche cards you're looking for. My outlet really in this is just like I love to code and sort of parse data, and I love being surprised by things. I think in my cube overview, I was really busy like last year, and I didn't really have time to like go through spoiler season, and so like when I ran the algorithm after like a couple months away, like there was this new card like Atraxa of the Grand Unifier. Like I had not heard of this card at all because I'd just been away from Magic for a bit, and so like that's a surprise to me. Like oh cool, this is like a new card. And I think that is a lot of the fun and creativity for me is like being surprised by like what can come in, and sometimes what leaves too. And then outside of like actual Magic itself, like I just love to code things, and so when I see something that like is kind of amenable to like a data driven process, like I'm on board, in terms of sort of finding a way to sort of quantify things or sort of parse through the data to get to a good decision, whatever a good decision looks like for the particular problem at hand, which is variable.
What's been most surprising in developing this project, and then what have you found most surprising about the development of vintage cubes in general?
Um, Well, I'll have to think about this one because I've been working on this so long, and it's been such an incremental thing. I think actually that's probably the most surprising thing is I did not think that this was going to end up taking this much time because like I actually did this like to save myself time originally, um, and yes, it's true now I can generate a cube in like a minute, 50 seconds or something like that. But like I still spent a lot of time like going through and improving the source code and things like that, and I've enjoyed it. So I think that's probably been the most surprising thing is because it's like I did this to save time, but now I'm like spending as much or more time like writing this algorithm or on this whole project in general, and that's certainly been a surprise, but not an unwelcome one. Again, this is a hobby, and so I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it, right? And in terms of the things that I could be working on, Magic is a pretty fun one to be, spending time tinkering with, right? And I think we can all agree on that. In terms of vintage cubes in general, I don't think my insights are going to be necessarily more in depth than, say, a human curator who is spending a lot of time thinking about Vintage Cube and going through cards in spoiler season and really um, sort of evaluating things, because there are so many great, curators out there and content creators as well who can give you, well reasoned analysis. Um, but yeah, it has been interesting to see, not insight from like cube design, but it has been interesting to see the evolution of vintage cubes, with cards that are kind of, well, to be honest, are sometimes kind of unfun, even for me, for someone like myself who enjoys vintage cube, which is like, initiative really taking over. A lot of games being decided around that. That's been interesting, and I think that's also informed a lot too of like how other cards have become more popular. And I think I had already mentioned Flash. Like, that card for years was like nowhere to be found, but like in the last year or so, like definitely made its way back in. Probably because just things are just, there's like more things to combo with it. First of all, but second, because like things like initiative exist to like we're going hard or going home, I suppose.
And you noted something like Atraxa that makes Flash so much more appealing, or the
Right.
increase of enters the battlefield abilities like that.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny too because like right, like attraction, I like it percolated to like the top of the data real quickly, so that like yeah, this is a included in the cube with like almost within like weeks, I think, of it like being out in the wild. Whereas like something like Flash took a little longer to like get into the cube, which I find interesting because it seems like such a great engine card. I'm happy it's in the cube now because I think it's got a well deserved spot there.
So, what applications do you see for data generated tools for cubes going forward?
Well, I think what is interesting is my process for creating cubes generally, which is, again, it doesn't actually have to be a vintage cube. Um, my process allows you to create cubes of any stripe that you are wanting to create. That, again, you have to have some data to sample. So, if you are curious again about what what's being played in Legacy or some other, sort of custom format, what other sort of cubes have a counters focus. Like, you could sample a bunch of cubes and kind of figure out what are like common things that are being played, or maybe things that are like those diamonds in the rough, right? Like things you hadn't considered before, and being pleasantly surprised, but to find something new that might be a good synergy with counters. Um, and then just doing general analysis too. Like, people are just interested in like descriptive statistics. Like, I think recently, people had asked for a, sort of a CubeCon 2024. Like, what's the average of all those cubes? And that we were able to do that, pretty quickly, with this process, and kind of see like what's in there. And that's helpful. And then I think, yeah, something I find a lot is that the vintage one specifically is cloned like all the time. Like, there's a lot of clones of that cube on CubeCobra, because people are using it as a starting point for their own like vintage cube designs. Like, right, like this is a good,
Yeah.
it's like a good like central, it's a, in terms of like cluster analysis, like if this is like a centroid of like vintage cubes that people can sort of like to sort of have a vanilla stock starting point, and then sort of customize with their own twists, their own flavor, their own preferences.
So this is a broad spectrum of analysis and design and curation that a lot of people don't get into. What sort of advice would you give to cube curators based on your experience here?
Well, since my process is so different, I don't know how broadly applicable it is to the sort of swath of cube designers who are normal, unlike myself, and actually making sort of informed decisions on what to include in their cube. I do think that it's great that we have so much creativity in the cube community, and I think that I would just encourage people to continue to put whatever they like in their cubes, and to enjoy that process. And it doesn't have to be. It can be whatever you want it to be, really.
I like that. I would also say that you're probably more informed than almost anybody else in terms of the construction of a vintage cube. in a certain way.
I look at a lot of data. Yeah, I do look at a lot of data on it and on what goes in and out. That doesn't mean that I'm actually better at evaluating cards, though. In fact, I think sometimes I can have blinders on based on what goes in the cube. And I think a good example of this is like a year ago when initiative cards were still kind of newer. Someone, I think it was Steve Mann, who I never met this person, but he's quite prevalent on like the MTG Cube subreddit, and he made, I don't know, there was some post where basically it was like Undermountain Adventure is like better than Oracle of Moldiah, and it's like it's gonna like take that slot. And I was looking at my data, and my data right now that then was like Oracle of Moldiah is like way more played than Undermountain Adventure, so it must be a better card. And that was actually not like we had like a subreddit back and forth on this. I think you know, time has told me I was wrong on this very clearly. Um, but that is a case where the data actually, misled me, or I was allowed myself to be misled by the data just because more people were putting Oracle of Moldiah in their cubes than an Undermountain Adventure. And so I think that's a good example of like maybe not always like adhering to exactly what the data says. And to be fair, like nowadays, I don't believe I actually have Oracle of Moldiah in the cube anymore. It's actually fallen out of the cube in favor of cards like Undermountain Adventure. So it just took the data a while to catch up to where things were weighted such that Undermountain Adventure took that top spot.
Yeah, I imagine Oracle Moldiah has certainly gone the way of Muldrifter and friends. Time has not been as
Yes,
kind.
yes, I still love that card, but yeah, too many fast things happening in Vintage Cube.
Well, what's next for you as a designer?
I don't think I really have any plans next as a designer because I'm not actually in the space of like curating cubes. So like full disclosure here, things I get out of cube are, well, a, it's fun to have like a vintage cube and bring it and allow people to play that. That's always fun. But b, something I actually really care about is the community that I'm a part of, and so basically interacting with my cube group is and having friends there is really important to me, and going to CubeCon, things like that, meeting great folks. And so I care much less about actually generating new projects as much as I do interacting with the fantastic Cube community. And so that's really, I'm here for the Tuesday night drafts and for the lulls.
Well, excellent. Well, as part of wrap up, then, if you could have any card printed as a judge promo, what card would it be, and who would you have do the illustration?
Oof. Can I choose a cycle of cards? Actually, would that be okay with you instead of a single one?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, I the Triumphs, bless their hearts, are fantastic fixing. Why is it named after some like magic character I don't even know? Like who is Yatora? I don't know. And so a can we like get like different maybe card names, and b like different art would be fantastic. Like, and I actually do like the actual Triumphs, like the Raugerin Triumph, even though it's like linked to a plane. I actually like the Vista art on that. That's pretty. So if we can just get like the Streets of New Capenna Triumphs redone and into some new arts, maybe some new card names, that would be fantastic. And who do I want to do the art? I don't know. I really like Donata Giancola's art style. So I don't know if he actually does a lot of lands, but like if he could do like a sort of a nice sort of kind of pastel kind of colors scheme like landscape, that would be like amazing for some of those lands. I don't know what an Esper landscape would look like with his style, but that would be amazing.
I say, and it would probably be a neat contrast to some of the more angular triumphs from Ikoria, right?
Right. Absolutely. Which I actually do like that style too. The special art treatment that you get in Yokoria.
Well, Daniel, this has been fascinating, and I've had such a great time chatting through. I'm sure we're just scratching the surface of this project, but I appreciate you taking the time to talk us through all of it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Cade. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
If people want to get to know a little bit more about this project or perhaps other things you're working on, where would be the best place to point them?
I think there are in the magic space. There are two places you can find me. So first, you can find me on CubeCobra. You can just drop a comment in the blog, like drop a comment in the blog post or something like that, and I'm pretty good about responding to comments, and we can connect that way. Uh, the other way is on Discord. So you can find me at Logarithmic, and if you provide a link to in the show notes, then that's great because I have the very complicated spelling of logarithmic, which no one seems to remember, not even myself.
Well, this has indeed been a joy. Looking forward to connecting, hopefully here at CubeCon in the fall and whenever the opportunity arises.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Cade.